Yeah, the imagination stuff is fun. When you get to use your imagination every day in your job, I'm telling you, folks, pentesting APIs can be a blast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the API Pentest Guide SiegeCast. I'm Douglas, and I'm a senior cybersecurity consultant here at Red Siege, and I'm here with Stuart.
Yes, I'm also a pen tester here at Red Siege. I've been pen testing since 2011 with some specialty in web application assessment.
Awesome. All right, so let's start this conversation off by asking, what is an API penetration test? First of all, I guess we should say what an API is, right?
That's right, yeah. A lot of people really don't know, and it's an application programming interface.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's everywhere. It drives so many things. Mobile applications use them, IoT devices use them. And, in fact, if they didn't exist and if they weren't secure, we probably wouldn't even have a lot of the innovations that we have, even with automated vehicles, like autonomous vehicles, right?
Yeah, I liked what you and I were talking about the other day about how you said APIs are sort of like the heavy lifters nowadays for web applications. And you're right, we see them in everything. I mean, they're being used to run any type of smart device, even refrigerators.
Yep, absolutely. Just sitting in the back end, fetching and querying, updating data, so that you don't have to go directly to the database and it's over HTTPS or an HTTP protocol. And it's that way it's easy to consume from the device or whatever, client you're going to be consuming the APIs from. So when it comes down to penetration testing an API, there's many ways that we could go about doing this, but there's always the solid OWASP API pen testing top 10 that you can use as a guide. And we're going to be using that in this conversation here. We're going to break it down and talk about each one of those topics.
Yes, yeah, OWASP does a great job at that. I mean, we know that they've done that for years with Top 10 Web. I believe they also have a mobile one as well. Yeah, the API bit is definitely, it's one of the great places that you can start when you're looking to assess APIs.
Yep, absolutely. So whenever we get asked to do an API assessment, what are some of the things that we ask the client for?
Oh, man. I tell you, the biggest thing I like to get is documentation of the authentication into the API, example requests and responses so that I'll know when I start doing the test that I'm hitting the ground running. I'm not running into issues that I have to troubleshoot. Those are the things I really like. Having a complete Swagger doc of the API with all the endpoints listed, the functions, what parameters they're taking in and what types they are, all of that is very handy.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. And which do you prefer? Do you prefer when a client provides us with like full credentials that we have to enter into the site in order to get the authorization tokens? Or do you prefer whenever the client just gives you an authorization token to use for the testing?
That's a good question. A lot of times it's nice for them just to go ahead and give you the token so that you can just plug it in and go on through. But again, I think the main point would just be that as long as we had something that works, that we're not having to spend 2-3 days troubleshooting, that is honestly the best thing because that eats up the time, So yeah, just hitting the ground running.
Yeah, it's actually kind of common to get tokens from clients that were honestly just meant for other environments and they just straight up don't work right away.
Oh my goodness, yes, I've had that happen before. It's like, oh, oops, this was meant for this environment, and we gave you the one for this staging environment. So, yeah, definitely want to make sure we avoid those pitfalls.
Yes, absolutely. And another thing that we like seeing as consultants for doing the API penetration tests is the client's preparation. So beforehand, it's nice to have developers with a clear line of communication the entire time during the entire pen test, because sometimes your point of contact when you're doing an assessment is like a security director or like maybe a CISO or something that might not know the answers to those questions. And there's going to be times in which the developers might be on vacation. So
Right.
that just puts a big delay on us, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you always want to make sure you have the right people lined up. That way, you always have someone to hit up and say, hey, this isn't working. Is there something that we can do to get it going? Because again, at the end of the day, we are all on a timeline, and we want to make sure we get in as much work as possible for that's over.
Yes. And whenever you're including the developers, they have a much deeper understanding of all of the areas of user input. Now, yes. Yeah. And also DevOps folks too, because you're testing the service. When you're testing an API fully, you're also testing for security misconfigurations, which we're going to be talking about later. So, the more the merrier from the client side when preparing for an API penetration test for this, to get an absolute thorough report, from us. So, okay, so I guess time to move into actually hacking and talking about the OWASP API top 10, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. I think the first one is broken object level authorization, which we typically call BOLAs, right?
Yes, we do. Yeah. So broken object level authorization is when you are able to change user input. Say you have like a sequential identifier, like, you have your URL and then you have a question mark and then you have, UID equals, and then you have, I don't know, like Douglas Berdeaux, right? What happens if you were to just put in Stuart Rorer, right?
Right. Yeah. Would my record show up? If it does, that could be a problem, especially if you don't have privilege.
Yeah. So that object, the data object that comes back from the API in the HTTP response may include your information, like you just said. And, that doesn't seem right? There should be some sort of mechanism that checks whether or not I'm authorized to view that data, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There always should be something on the back end that's checking, saying, hey, is this correct? Should this happen? And there's something on the back end that should also log something like that. If someone is consistently probing like that, that is a sign of a potential attack. It needs to be logged on the back end.
Yep, actually, absolutely. Be consumed by a SIM or even for accounting purposes as well. I totally agree with that. So BOLA is a thing that's actually rather common, and I feel like it's something that bug bounty hunters find constantly. And I'm guessing that it's, because it's so prevalent in web applications APIs, that's probably the reason why so many of the OWASP API top 10 is surrounding authorization, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, if there's an issue within the authorization area, that's going to affect the application as a whole. That's one of the main aspects of the application. So, I think that a lot of times the foundational aspects of web applications, whether it's authentication, authorization, session management, anytime that there are holes in those areas, that's going to be a problem and potentially lead to other problems that will stack on top of each other. So BOLAs are definitely something to watch out for. And like you said, they seem to find their way creeping into stuff all the time.
Yeah, and they're just as easy to find too. Jeez, that's like a low-hanging fruit almost, right?
Yeah, we were talking the other day about how, we have a curious type of mind. And we were talking about if you saw something in a URL with a number, you just automatically want to either, increment that number or decrement that number and to see what happens. It's just, that's how we think. Now, we were joking because we said there's a lot of people in this world that just don't care. Like, it's a number, I don't care, move on, but not to us, and I'm sure that there's many other people out there who are like us that are going to say, I wonder what happens when I change that 500 to 501. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's kind of strange to take that information, especially if you're doing something like get my user data. There's so many ways to defeat authorization there. There's so many ways that somebody could potentially defeat authorization there that actually performing the authorization checks might be a little bit tricky, right?
Yeah, I think anytime, again, when you're dealing with those sort of foundational aspects of whether it's a web application or an API, getting authorization, authentication, session management, even user input, all of those are really tough, and especially if they were in any way custom made. A lot of times people will resort to frameworks because they're often a little bit more vetted. But when you're dealing with something that's more made in-house, it seems like things can creep in fairly easily.
Absolutely. Updates, upgrades, adding functionality, stuff being lobbed over the wall by your product owners. Yeah, I get that. I've been there. But anyways, what I was going to say was the aspect of authorization surrounding the API, a lot of that can actually be caught. Authorization issues. Some of it may be caught by just adding in security into your software development lifecycle. So, you code up something, you throw it into test, then you have, some sort of internal pen testers take a look at it, try to hack away at it. You can actually use code security scanners. Maybe those might be able to find information that way. Where some of them are really good at finding command injection, SQL injection, stuff like that. So that's always something that I'm always talking to clients about, is baking the security into the SDLC.
Yeah, be more proactive than reactive. That's always, I think, the best way to be. Prepare, expect issues, and test for them as best as you can.
Yeah. So BOLA being part of the OWASP top 10 and for APIs, and how you can visualize how an API will actually fetch and retrieve data, essentially show data, expose it to users on the internet. It's probably a big reason why it's absolutely required to do some testing around that during an API penetration test. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. So this BOLA one, broken authorization, object level authorization, kind of bleeds into the next one. Authentication, broken authentication is the next one. And authorization and authentication are two big heavy hitters with web application penetration testing alone. No matter it's API or just pen testing a web app, the authenticator is actually going to make the tokens to perform the authorization. So do you want to say a little bit about, some of the things that you've seen maybe, or why, or what you actually look for whenever you're testing authentication during an API pen test?
Yeah, authentication is definitely one of those areas that sometimes people breeze over because they think, oh, it's simple username, password, or some other similar method into getting into the API. The problem is sometimes that authentication isn't working, API wide or application wide. So one of the things I like to test for at the very beginning is trying to see what things I can access without authentication, and checking to see, are those things, should it be allowed? And it's amazing sometimes when you're going through the different functions of an API and you're like, oh, wow, I can actually, get user data, but I'm not even authenticated. And I have found quite a bit of findings in that area where I'm able to query an API and I'm getting user data that's pretty sensitive that I shouldn't be. And I'm not even authenticated.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you need to authenticate to get those tokens for the authorization stuff. Exactly. And you're right. It's easily overlooked, especially if somebody is, employing some sort of third-party service to create the tokens or perform the authentication. Maybe they'll say, hey, that's out of scope. But when it comes to API pen testing, when you're actually doing the authorization testing, it kind of bleeds into it. It's kind of hard to do one without the other, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's funny, and it's so easy to mix up authentication and authorization. We were joking again the other day. We know the difference, but it's like our tongues want to just play a game on us, and we'll end up saying the wrong one just as a trick. But with authentication, even beyond accessing things that I'm not supposed to be able to, a lot of times just finding silly things like a token is still usable, that it's not expired. I've recalled several APIs I've tested where I've had an admin account and I've been logged in. I have this token, I can add users. Then I'll actually go through the process of logging out, but I can still, in my burp repeater, send that same request. And even though I'm logged out, it's still actively adding users. So that's, in my opinion, another issue where the authentication's been broken.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah, the authenticator that creates the token, especially if it's JWT, it's going to set the expiration date. And if you log out, something should notify the authenticator, or the authorization, whatever's being handled there, that token's no longer valid. So yeah, I totally get that. Yeah, there's so many moving parts when it comes to authentication, especially if you have a third party, some sort of whomever to make your JWTs for you. And then the JWT gets set in your browser or whatever, and then you start working in the web application, fine and dandy. But some clients have actual auditors that come in and say, hey, how are you tweaking these settings? When you go into that third party, is there a way to essentially set the expiration date, or is there a way to actually set that a token is no longer valid? Stuff, small things like that, so they can creep in, without you knowing. That's why, obviously for API penetration test, it's super important to test the authentication.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, again, one of the foundational pieces, whether it's a web app or an API.
Yeah. One of the things that I come to mind whenever I'm pen testing a web app or API is for authentication is, did they make their own authentication, which is typically normally the case for me, to be honest with you.
Oh, wow.
So yeah. So like, can I enumerate usernames or emails? Can I use the forgot password and just run through burp intruder or use wfuzz to try to find some sort of way, whether it's through even the timing of the HTTP responses between invalid and valid users, like, can I enumerate users? And OWASP actually considers that broken authentication.
That's interesting. Yeah. And I think we were even talking again previously about how through enumeration, there's so many different ways to get it. It's not just, say, through the login or through even a forgot password, but even through registration, and sometimes through other means, like when you're doing a username suggestion and it's polling to see if someone else already has that username. You can write a script to just keep suggesting them and seeing which one's already taken. So, I mean, yeah, you're right. It seems like a small issue, but it can lead to a bigger issue, because then you have a whole list of things to brute force.
Yes, it's a lot better from a red team perspective when we find username enumeration, but email enumeration, considering you have so many email domains that people are using all over the internet, I feel like it's not that big of a deal. And also, whenever you're communicating this to clients, like, hey, I can enumerate users on your system through, sometimes 2 or 3 different areas of functions in the API or the authentication mechanism. Do you ever get pushback where clients are like, hey, we can't put a CAPTCHA literally on every one of these pages because people would get annoyed?
Yeah, that's probably one of the things that I have got pushback on. A lot of times when I do mention things like user enumeration, a lot of times they say, well, we can't help that. And I understand that, like with regards to the registration example, because they do have to perform a check that says, does that user already exist? It's like you said. So there has to be a way that they let the person know that they can't have that username. That's one of the few times that there really isn't a generic message, because I mean, you just realize, well, someone's already got it. But yeah, there has been a lot of pushback on that. And again, sometimes security is not a one size fit all, so you sort of have to let the client decide what they want to do with that information.
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest things in cybersecurity, is like to know the intuition of when you should be able to accept risk or not. And like the CAPTCHA is probably a small thing to put into there to stop automated attacks. But like you said, you could go through manually and click the CAPTCHA every time. Or if there's like some sort of way to bypass CAPTCHA that people come up with, there's always that issue. When you're relying on third parties, services or solutions for things like CAPTCHA and authentication, authorization, that kind of stuff, there's always that risk. So there's kind of risk everywhere. But yeah. What do you think about compromised accounts? Do you ever find yourself talking through the report and you have to tell a client, hey, I didn't see MFA?
Yeah, that's another one that I'm starting to have to report on more and more. And it's one that I get pushed back on as well. So that, again, is one of the things that, even though I suggested, it's really up to the client to determine what they're going to do with that information. But yeah, compromised accounts, especially lately with all the different compromises, they're becoming more and more available and more quickly. So I think that they're definitely becoming a tool for a common pen test methodology, if you have access to those, when you're checking to see if, like, this client has any accounts listed, and then you find one that works, that's a problem. So having MFA to alert the user, hey, someone's trying to log in, that's a great thing. I use MFA, and even though it's really irritating when like I'm in a hurry, I'm like, all right, yeah, you're my necessary evil, so I accept it.
Yeah, breach passwords and password stuffing is something that's, and again, it's another low-hanging fruit. It's so nice when you get that right. But I mean, it's a bad thing, but obviously as red teamers, it's a little bit helpful for us.
Oh yeah.
All right. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to agree. Yeah, completely. Yeah. I mean, anything that gets you a step up into the environment, gets you closer. As a pen tester, red teamer, whatever, it's definitely a bonus. But you're right, it's obviously not a good thing for the client, but at least we can tell them about it and hopefully they can fix it.
Yes. All right. So we're still in authentication, and let's move down to password policy, everyone's favorite topic.
Yeah, sort of the Snoresville type stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's important because again, if a username and password is the primary means of accessing the API, you're going to want to make sure you have really good guidelines there to help protect whichever user that they're forced to actually have strong passwords. Weak passwords are easily guessed, brute forced, and then potentially lead to the next step, as we were talking about in our engagement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so deterring automation, using the CAPTCHA, that again, that's bleeding now into this topic also with the password policy stuff. And you're right about hardening password requirements. And NIST does a really good job. NIST. If you folks haven't read through those or not, for web applications, it's actually rather lax. They as long as you have MFA, and it's the password isn't something that's very easily guessable, because people can become numb to MFA prompts all the time on their cell phones and tablets and such. 10 tries before a lockout. Lockout policy is something we have to ask the client for before every web app assessment, because that's something that we do test, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Showing passwords while typing them. What do you think of that?
Well, I'll tell you, I love it when I'm at home, because sometimes I definitely run into the issue where I'm typing my password and I'm like, oh man, I'm registering an account and I'm like, crap, I don't remember if I put in that right or not. And so being able to click to see that I did is helpful. The only thing I could think of that it would be bad is if you were maybe in a more public area or at a place of work, then you get shoulder served.
All right. So yeah, that's another one of the NIST guideline things too. That should at least be an option. But I'm a big fan of 1Password and password managers. So I just let that handle everything for me. But at the same time, you still have to log into 1Password, and it's still going to be a password in your head somewhere, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So obviously authentication is a huge aspect of APIs. So like if you were to bypass authentication, your API is pretty much toast. So it's probably a really good thing to test during an API penetration test. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that would almost be like getting a home inspection and not having them look at your foundation of the house. That would be bad, and then you move in and find out that there's not only a gigantic crack in the garage, but your house is uneven and letting in a lot of water.
Yeah, over mine. All right, so authentication has now bled back into authorization again. Here we have broken object property level authorization, BOPLA. So this is excessive data exposure, essentially. Like you say, you query an API for, you're just watching the API query to get your profile data once you've already created an account in the web application, and you see that it's returning a lot of stuff that's not even in the UI, such as like, PII, like your birthday, your SSN, even like your password hash. Like I've seen all kinds of crazy stuff come in this form. What areas around BOPLA do you think you see the most, or like what areas of BOPLA are you like most concerned about whenever you're performing an API penetration test?
I think, as you said, the excessive data exposure is the biggest thing that I'm typically looking for. A lot of APIs are very verbose, and sometimes they're so verbose that they're telling you everything, just like you said. And I remember one that I was testing once. It was like a chat application, and when you would talk with this thing was, I think it was like some sort of AI entity. It would talk back to you. But the weird thing was you could see other people's ongoing conversations at times. Every now and then they would just sort of show up in like in an array list, in a JSON response. And I was like, ooh, well, I bet there's a lot of people out there that don't want me to see what they're talking about. But yeah, so that's a perfect example. I've seen examples before where I think I've mentioned this one before, where it was listing, I was logging in and it was listing in like the 10 or 15 last logged in users, and it even contained a password hash. Those are the types of things that you need to watch out for in this category.
Absolutely. So it's kind of a big deal when you're performing an API penetration test. You know, you're always looking for excessive data exposure, right?
Yeah, I mean, even when you think of web apps, you're looking for stack traces. And anything that's going to reveal something about the backend architecture. So this is kind of like the same thing, but a little bit of a step up. You know, is it revealing any of that, and also PII or something that we really shouldn't see?
Yeah, imagine an attack chain where a threat actor gets your credentials, Stuart, and they go to the web app and they realize that from already logging into the web app using their own registration and credentials, that they can see this type of data exposure. Imagine if the app lacked MFA. It's part of the authentication piece. And, you know, somebody got your credentials through phishing or, you know, cross-site scripting, some other type of, you know, vulnerability that you would leverage during a social engineering attack, or just like you were talking about before with the breached passwords and credentials, password stuffing. And they just they just log into the app and then they just query the chat program, and you know, they see other people's chats, or in my example, they get the profile data. They click on my profile and they're seeing your birthday, your name, your address, you know, your SSN, your hash password, whatever. So it's kind of a big deal to test for this when doing API penetration testing, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. You know, and one of the key things for catching this, if you're using an intercept proxy, please make sure your responses are turned on, that you're not just looking and monitoring the requests.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so unrestricted resource consumption. Here we go with rate limiting. This is something that I personally never really get a chance to test, though I see it sometimes by accident. It's something that I don't test because either A, I'm testing in a staging or a dev environment, or B, I'm testing in production. So either way, I kind of can't. You know, I don't want to knock the site down and cause a disruption for the client's users. At the same time, in the test and dev environments, most folks don't even have rate limiting turned on there anyway, because they're doing tests on their own there.
Yeah, that's what I typically find too. Every now and then I'll have a client that will openly tell me that they're doing some sort of limiting. In fact, I just had one recently, and so we talked about if they wanted that tested, and in that case, they were just like, no, we'll put you on an allow list to let you test, because I mean, when we're doing different types of iterations of our test, they obviously ramp up fairly quickly. But you're right, it's sort of one of those weird spaces. But if it's one of those things that is very important to the application, which I can see a lot of scenarios where it would be, then it definitely should be tested, and there should be a time where it's scheduled. And I think you once had a really good idea about setting aside a specific test environment and trying to clone production and making sure it's done within hours that are acceptable.
Yeah, it's just not everybody wants to do that.
Yeah, that's right.
They want us to do all the work. Yeah. So, okay. So we can, sometimes you're right. Sometimes it is important to the client, or sometimes it's like an audit requirement, right? Because of how ubiquitous maybe the application may be, maybe it's millions of users and they really need to test this. So one of the things that gets tested during rate limiting, or the reason why rate limiting exists, is because sometimes the API is going to perform a large query on the database. Maybe it's querying on data that's not keyed, or something in which takes a lot of CPU power from the database itself to send back to the API and then back to the user. So in that instance, if you didn't rate limit that, you could kind of like slow down the backend database. And then sometimes all of that data coming back, if say an API is just doing select star on, you know, products, and then the API code itself, like say PHP, ASPX, whatever, then sorts through the data then you have the problem of the CPU usage on the server kind of being bogged down. So if you don't rate limit that, it's kind of super important. So that's why it's probably important to test during an API assessment. Although, like I said, I don't really ever get a chance to test it very much, though I see it by accident. It's like when I'm using Intruder or WFuzz, I'll start, you'll see the HTTP 200s turn into a different number. I think it's 427 or 407 or something.
Yeah. Or even sometimes they'll just shut you out.
Oh, yeah.
And you'll start seeing failure to connect.
Yeah. Okay, moving down to the next one. This is another authorization topic. Hooray! We have BFLA. So this is broken function level authorization. It's very close to broken object level authorization, but one is the authorization around whether or not somebody can access an object, like the data coming back, and this one is a function.
Yes.
There's going to be administrative functions, semi-administrative functions. There's going to be functions that only users can use that maybe admins can't use or shouldn't be using. So do you want to tell me about your experience with like testing BFLA or maybe things you may have seen?
Yeah, that's another one that I do see pop up quite a bit because, like you said, there's a lot of in-house applications where this stuff is custom written. And I can recall one particular that had a lot of roles. And anytime I see a lot of roles, I think, okay, that means that they have to account for quite a bit of stuff. And so this one actually had user roles and manager roles, and then like an admin role and something in between the manager and the admin role. And I was able to find that some of the lower level accounts could actually access the admin or higher level functions. And it was almost like a stair step. It was like I took an account that was a low level account and I was able to get myself added into like sort of a sub manager account. And then I was able to use the sub manager account once I had that authorization to upgrade myself again. And it was, like I said, a stair stepper until I eventually got admin over the whole, application through the API. So yeah, it's definitely something to check for, and it's something that can be easily missed, especially when you're dealing with a very large, complex, API for an application.
Yes, and privilege escalation is a very good point. That's awesome, Stuart. Another, test case scenario would be like just moving laterally. Like, hey, I can update my, again, it's a benign example, but I can update my profile image. Can I update your profile image, right?
Yeah. And that becomes even greater risk if you can, for instance, upload SVGs that are tainted with cross-site scripting.
Yes. Yeah, or just a whole nother file altogether. The EDR, maybe EDRs. Have you ever seen EDR in a web server? Let's be honest with each other.
I've actually gotten hit by EDR before on web applications. Yeah, I remember one about a year ago that I was testing that I was trying to upload an EICAR file, and it nailed it.
Ah, yes. Okay. Actually, I do remember that. Yeah,
that's
great. Wow. I do remember that test case when I had one also.
But years ago, you're right. You could upload anything. And I'm not talking about even years ago. I'm talking maybe even like 5 years ago. I'm finding out a lot more and more recently. I guess because of the advent of all the malware that we're seeing just in ransomware just fly through, all over the places through compromises. But yeah, it is different. It's funny when you've been in technology for so long. I know, and you and I both have been in a long time. We've been pen testing for a long time, but I think both of us have also been on the, networking side and stuff like that even longer. And it's just, you literally each decade see different changes.
Well, luckily I've never had to do networking. I was a developer though, which I don't know which is worse.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So again, this is another huge authorization type of issue. Authorization is something that requires a lot of scrutiny if you're going to make your own web API or even just your web applications. There's so many moving parts. That's why it's a really good idea to have an API penetration test,
Yeah, and that was something that was really important when we were coming up and talking about this topic here, was how APIs are so easily skirted over, both by clients and pen testers, because a lot of times clients don't have the information that they need to provide for a proper API test, or they don't really feel like they're an area of vulnerability. On the flip side, there's a lot of pen testers out there who are uncomfortable with testing APIs because they're not, say, visual, or they seem so arcane. So again, there's sort of like this vacuum, this hole that needs to be filled and addressed. So it's important that people are coming up to speed on the vulnerabilities, the security issues within the API, and they're, like you've been talking about, so heavily grouped together. And so glad OWASP has put together such a comprehensive guide.
Yes, absolutely. So if any of those types of testers are watching, API pen testing is actually a lot of fun.
Yes. Once you really start getting into it, and you'll start finding a lot of stuff, and you're like, wow, this is insane. I cannot believe I just pulled that off.
Oh, I know some of the stories we could tell, right? Plus the other thing that you just said about OWASP making this guide for us that we're going through now, all of the top 10, that's not your end all be all. There's still other stuff that you're going to be testing. Obviously user input areas everywhere, so anywhere there's user inputs, close it.
Yeah, I mean, user input testing is definitely probably one of my primary go-tos for anything, whether it be web apps or whether it be APIs, even mobile applications, because they're usually a mixture of APIs and web, and sometimes if it's native enough, there is a mobile component. But you're right, inputs are our way in. They're like the windows and the doors for web applications and APIs.
Absolutely. And they're in places you might not even think of, like cookies, HTTP headers. We can't just assume that all of that's going to be untrusted by the server. In fact, don't. Just think the server trusts anything that you give it, and you'll be successful as a pen tester.
That's right. That's right. Abuse trust.
Yes. All right. So obviously that's very important for pen testing, the BFLA, because we have the function, we talked about the object level. There's a lot of authorization stuff that we're going to be talking about. The next one is unrestricted access to sensitive business flows. My friend, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, that's one of the really interesting ones, sort of one I think that does get looked over a lot, like skipped, I should say. And typically it's when you are coming across, whether it be a web application or an API, you have to stop and think, what is unique to this API or web application? What does this business do? What are some business flows, some sensitive things that would be a problem for them, and trying to figure out how you could abuse that. And you came up with an excellent one when we were talking about this the other day about sort of scalping things, finding a way to suck up the inventory of items and then selling them higher on the market or something like that. I thought that was a great example of a business flow abuse.
There are parts of the business flow that you may not think of that you could do very simple checks on. So for instance, in the case of the test case scenario of scalping, say your business says you're only allowed to order 2 per household of a certain item, right? And then somebody goes into there and they're looking at the API and that check for the 2 households, or I'm sorry, 2 per household is done with JavaScript. You hope that it's not, but because you want at least everyone to have 2. You don't want somebody to just get around the JavaScript part and go right to the API. That's like, the folks that designed something like that thought that JavaScript was part of the business flow. Like, that's going to handle this, and then, so we're not going to do that. Right. So pen testing the API directly, that's obviously that's skirting business flows is obviously a big deal because of that. And also, what if somebody just made a whole bunch of accounts that pointed to the same physical address, and then they just used all of those accounts to consume the entire, like, I hate when a product is limited to like 1,000 or 500 pieces, especially like, physical Switch games or video games these days, right? And you go to buy one and you're sitting there, you're waiting, it's going to be released, and you're just like refreshing the page. You're like, come on, I want to order this. I really want this game, right? And it's in your cart and you're ready to go, and then it just says an error occurred, and then they're just out of stock.
Oh, I've had that happen. I hate that. Oh man, I've had that happen before. I'm like, it was in my cart. Why is it gone?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of people on planet Earth. I mean, holy cow, right? But and it could be that there were a lot of people, but our brains, like you were talking about earlier, the way we think as hackers, like somebody definitely scripted that. Somebody got around that. Somebody knew this was going to occur, and good hackers will go into a system, like threat actors. They'll go into a system and sit there for a long time, and then there's like the script kiddies. They get into a system and they post somewhere like, holy cow, look what I did, and then they're just busted, they're caught, they're booted out, right? So whenever you're doing your pen test, you also want to make sure that people can't figure this stuff out to defeat certain business flows in that manner. And there's a lot of small, easy, simple tricks you probably think of as a developer to put in place to ensure that the business flows work correctly. And if step one didn't work, just use like a whiteboard and make a big flow chart. Have your whole development team sit down. Have people outside the development team sit down and actually just like say, because these people, people that don't know how that web app's going to work, I promise you, they're going to come up with ideas that are going to be like, well, what if somebody just did this or this? And you're going to be like, and as a developer, your brain's going to be like, how did you even think of that? Because I've been there.
Yeah, I mean, what you're describing to me is exactly what I would suggest. I remember doing UML diagramming back in the day. I'm sure it's still done. And just defining use cases. And it's like, okay, well, we're expecting this to be one user, but then you need to think of, well, what if there are multiple users, or if someone finds a way to do X. So, yeah, I think you're right. You need to plot those out and think outside the box.
So our next topic is SSRF, server-side request forgery. And this comes about whenever your web application allows somebody to put in an address, a URL rather, or URI, whatever, allows you to put in a URL and your server reaches out to fetch something.
Yeah. There's some really interesting abuse cases there. I know you have one that I can't wait to hear again. But, the common example is just putting in something like localhost, where it's asking for, as you said, a URL, especially when you're doing something with maybe images or something along those lines, and you're pointing to a link. I could think of that. But there's also use cases where I've seen people turn SSRF into something sort of like a local file include as well, trying to see if they can point it toward a sensitive file and having that listed, or abusing some form of redirects.
Absolutely. There's always the issue of reputation also, letting people put in any URL to any image. I mean, obviously you're letting people, websites let people upload images too, but if your server is going out to these malicious, potentially illegal sites to pull stuff, bad, right?
Yeah, it's bad. It's one of those things that, again, when we're talking about designing something, it needs to be considered like, okay, I'm opening this up. Is this really a good idea? Should we find a way to restrict it? Because there are ways to restrict it. And, using proper cores and things like that can help with restricting origin. But still, there are some other protections that need to be in place on the back end to make sure that someone's not doing something crafty, especially if they're referencing like localhost and things like that as well.
Yeah, so that was my example that you were referring to earlier. Was I have used it to essentially enumerate hosts and services. Even it's just easy. You can plug in a port, a colon, and then a number at the end of a URL to sit, or not the end of a URL, but like the end of a domain name to say that's a port you want to go to. And in the case where I found it, the SSRF issue, I was able to just keep plugging in numbers like 10, 10, 10, 1, 10, 10, 10, 2, internal IP addresses. I started with 127.0.0.1 and it worked on 80, and it didn't work on 443. And then I realized that the client was using Cloudflare. And then, so I just kept going from there, and I found it even tried to connect to SSH, and it was like a blind attack though, because I couldn't really tell what was coming back. And like it wasn't like the benign example I've been using with the profile image. It was something completely different. It was trying to fetch a document or something. I forget what it was doing. And I noticed that the timing was different whenever I would try to fetch on a port that wasn't open rather than one that was. The one that wasn't open was actually faster. It just came back and said it probably was telling, the host was probably saying, that port's closed or whatever instantly. But I was able to just write a script. And when I showed it to the client was like, where did you get this map of our internal network? You're supposed to be pen testing our API. Yeah.
It's amazing what you created a custom port scanner. That's crazy, all using SSRF. And that's the fun part of this job, is trying to think outside the box, come up with some creative solutions and getting some awesome results.
Yeah, the imagination stuff is fun. When you get to use your imagination every day in your job, I'm telling you, folks, pen testing APIs can be a blast. Absolutely. But yeah, obviously SSRF is important for API penetration testing, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's definitely something you want to look for, especially when you're dealing with inputs. So when you're dealing with the inputs, start trying to think again, all right, this is a potential area that I need to check for this type of thing. And
there's tons of attacks, ways to approach SSRF and techniques and stuff. Like, there's tons of it. There's tons of materials everywhere too, online to learn about it. Like, that's a pretty deep subject, actually, SSRF. And it seems kind of new, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's funny. It has been around for a long time, but I think that it's one of those things. I think hacking in general, everything ends up repeating itself. We've always started out with the same attacks, and then they just go through iterations. And so as you move to a new platform like the cloud or whatever, you just see them come back in just a different form. I do see SSRF a lot more now than I have for a while, and things like APIs and even web applications, because it's just one of those things that people are not really thinking about when they're putting it in there. They're like, oh, I would never expect someone to put in localhost. So, again, that's the mindset that you have to develop.
Yeah, I think the development stuff, me spending over 13 years just in development alone for web stuff, it's just one day something just clicked. I was like, wait a minute, somebody could just take an SQL statement or terminate what I'm trying to put into this SQL and just, put a union or something and then comment out the rest of my, it's weird. You hear about these things when you're a developer. You hear about, secure coding practices, and you hear about vulnerabilities that people are exploiting everywhere, and they kind of sit in the back of your mind. But it's for me, at least, just one day it just clicked. I was like, wait a minute. I should start looking for all of this stuff. And I think that's how it happened, to be honest with you. I never found SSRF in standard web applications until three or 4 years ago, actually. And I think it's just something I never looked for. And then one day it clicked.
Yeah, I typically, when I would find them, a lot of times I think it would be like in a redirect sometimes. Or like I said before, I can recall some with file uploads. But yeah, it is interesting. And I like what you said just about being a developer and then having it sort of click, starting to put on the security hat, thinking, well, wait a second, I sort of need to take security in mind as I program and not have it be an afterthought, where we go back and put it in later. But yeah, it is interesting. And I think one of the things that makes you such an exceptional pen tester is the fact that you have that background. So you have been in both worlds. And that gives you just like a special vision to spot things.
Thank you. But yeah, it helps a lot to understand something a lot before performing the pen test. All right. So the next one's security misconfiguration. I always translate this to the service testing or the cloud service testing, the stuff that when I present to clients, like, hey, you have this issue, like where you don't have your content security policy set. And I found cross-site scripting, and I was able to pull a JavaScript file from a different server, like a private server. And that's really bad. I was able to execute the code there on your site. Sometimes I get pushback, like, you were supposed to pen test the API, not the security around the service itself. But all of that stuff ties together, like that's an attack chain, what I just described. Like if there's a bunch of vulnerabilities that exist that get you from point A to point B that you could leverage, that's part of it, right?
Yeah, it's almost like a person comes in and they complain about pain in their finger to the doctor, and then they scan them and find out that they have cancer. But they're like, oh, we're only going to focus on your finger, so that wouldn't be a good idea. And all of these things, as we talked about before, they sort of form a foundation. And when you have these little cracks, they add up. So having things like a content security policy to prevent execution of cross-site scripting is excellent. To the hacker, the pen tester, whatever, it's frustrating when it's actually in play. I mean, I think that has caused me a lot of gray hair in the past because it's like, I know I have it, but this thing's blocking it. Now I've got to try to figure out a way around it and get really creative. And glad it's there, but so that is a thing for sure. But the other thing about this is usually where we do find quite a bit of findings because people usually lack CSP or they're lacking other types of headers that should really be in place.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and what you just said about the, the gray hairs thing, when you do see a good CSP and it blocks your external script from coming in, I just recently went through this. I had to rely on just obfuscating the code and putting it into the request. But it turns out that the API was truncating the user input at like 20 bytes or something. So I couldn't get very far with it. So, it's a good thing and it's a bad thing. And for me, it's only a bad thing whenever I see a CSP. If I'm pen testing, it's a good thing if I see a CSP and it blocks my request when I'm pen testing a client that I actually use for a product or something, a subscription.
Yeah.
Makes you feel better.
Yeah, it does make you feel a little bit better when you see that, because that if some sort of zero-day XSS comes out, which they do, especially when people are incorporating third-party libraries, that it's there's an extra layer of protection, hopefully, that will block whatever execution could occur. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah. All right. So obviously this is super huge and this could go on forever. HSTS, like if you don't see HTTP strict transport security and they do have port 80 open, it's kind of bad, but it could be, actually it's not that bad. Clients always assume it's not that bad. Like, oh yeah, well, I guess we could just, enable that. But at the same time, enabling that could screw things up that, some sort of vendor solution or something that's on-prem, that's accessing something. Anytime you put in a security control, you got to put in the testing for that stuff too. And CISOs and people above that are doing cybersecurity directing, or even just, like folks that are in, in IT, they know that like, if you want to make a change, we have to have a change process. And that change process is going to extrapolate into all these various areas within our environment and testing all this different stuff. So when you say something like, hey, you have HSTS disabled and you have port 80 open, it may seem a little bit benign, but that's used in like a machine in the middle attack chain, right?
Yeah. Again, they add up when you do things like that. They seem like they're sort of non-issues, but
yeah. And if your authenticator is setting cookies without, I don't know if it's setting like, the secure, it's not setting the secure attribute on the cookie. Yep. It all kind of like comes together.
It does. It snowballs really.
Yeah.
And then that's when it really starts to become even a larger issue. And, even just keeping things up to date, like the backend service, such as Apache, making sure it's at the level it should be and has appropriate patches. So that way you're preventing remote code execution. That's another important thing as well, because as we said, like that's sort of like what everything is built on, is that's it's running off of that server. So if that's exploitable, that's going to create a big issue.
I feel like we could talk about this forever. We got to move on to the next one. We have improper inventory management. Assets are part of inventory, right? I remember being improper assets management, right?
Yeah, this is that really interesting one where, like for one example, you're trying to see if there's older versions of the API, because a lot of times, as we've said before, legacy code often leads to issues. So trying to see if you're testing V2, is there a V1, is there a V1.5, just going through fuzzing that and trying to find what might exist could lead to something quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you were talking about at the top of the SiegeCast, the documentation is part of this too.
Yeah.
This is a very frustrating topic.
Yeah. Lack of the documentation is in itself a vulnerability, because if you don't have it documented and you're unaware of what's there, you can easily lose sight of potential security issues, outdated functions that should be completely removed, which I've seen before that have led to some sort of security issue. So if you don't have the documentation to keep track of it, that's a problem.
Yes. And it's a problem for us. It's a problem for...
Oh, yeah. Hinders the test
clients.
if we don't have documentation. Yeah.
Yeah. Like say a cybersecurity director is in charge of doing a pen test. The auditors come in, the CISO comes down. He's like, dude, you need to get this pen tested. They vet out pen testers, and then pen testers come in. They're like, where's your documentation for this API? And they're like, we don't have any. You might not get a thorough test because your developers didn't, provide, they weren't creating that documentation for the API. They don't know what assets are just like floating around on servers. It's left up to the penetration tester, but the penetration tester is, time boxed to that window, that budgeted window where it's like, we have like 2 to 4 weeks or something to do this API pen test. We're not going to find everything. Threat actors have all the time in the world to find this stuff.
Yeah, that's an important thing to realize. We are time boxed, and not having any documentations like dumping us into this room that's completely just dark and you can't see anything, and like, okay, get to the other side, but keep in mind there's some obstacles on the way. You're going to bump into stuff, and it's just not going to be fun. But yeah, I mean, it's and we didn't develop it. If we didn't develop it, we really don't know it as intimately as, say, the developers do. So having that knowledge is vital. From the beginning time of like hacking knowledge, for me, like the ultimate goal was always going back to some sort of manual to try to figure out how the system worked. And it's the same for APIs, having any information on how it works and what it does, all that really helps.
Yes, in so many ways that you might not even recognize. For instance, what about the flip side, Stuart? Have you ever seen documentation that contains sensitive information that was published to the internet?
Yeah, or even extremely verbose documentation where it's just like the size of War and Peace. And you're like, how in the world am I going to get through all this before the test and through the test? And it's like really technical. And I don't mean like technical as in like the API use, but like maybe specifically to that person's product, where you really need to have, like, I've tested some really scientific stuff. And I mean, goodness, I love science. I love studying it, but some of the stuff goes way beyond me. And I'm like, oh, wow, they're doing some really high level math here, and I've only gone up to calculus. So, but it's kind of crazy how that stuff goes. But you're right. Yeah.
So this is important for API penetration testing to assess the inventory management. It's something that we just do. It's just like muscle memory for me at this point to run wfuzz against the API and try to find endpoints with like _dev, _test. Try to find stuff that's sitting there that the client might not know sitting there, because that's like our job, right? It's to show them what is versus what they think is, right?
That's right.
So
that's right.
Yeah, it's super important to do this type of testing. Okay, so the last one, unsafe consumption of APIs no one cares about. So that wraps up the SiegeCast.
I love that. Yeah. It's so funny because that is one I really don't think a lot of people do test for. And it's really hard to test for because it's not something we necessarily have control over or could view. It just really depends on how how it's perceived, the application, the API is receiving the inputs that are coming in. And if it's coming in on a back end through a different channel, we really cannot test that. Every now and then you can kind of do something where you're seeing stuff that looks like it might be coming in and try to see if you can manipulate it, try to get some second order stuff. But again, it's really tough to find that type of thing. You have to find a way to sort of get it to talk back to you so you can actually see that it's actually hitting something or doing something. But it is important for API pen test, at least for the developers of these APIs, to think about it and say, what am I allowing in? What am I consuming? It goes back to like what we were talking about with the business flow, examining that. That's something that I think that the developers really need to look at. And if they want it evaluated, they could show some flow charts to the testers to help them see. And then the tester could potentially say, well, this is going in through here. Are you sanitizing the input? That's something. Or positioning them on the network to where they're able to, hit that data as it comes in and then test it that way. But then you also have to be careful because you have to make sure you're not testing the third party without their permission, because then that would be a big issue. So, it's something that sounds like a very walking a catwalk, just very carefully. And it would definitely take some sitting down, some discussions with the client on how they want it tested and what would the limitations be. And I think that would probably be the best place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, well, you just answered that question. Why is it important? So thank you for that, because I couldn't. No, I'm just kidding. I understand that's important. I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
All right, Stuart. So what are some of the tools you use when you do an API penetration test? Like, what are some of the tools that you would recommend to somebody that was a web app somebody that never really did web app pen testing? Because the tools, obviously, you're going to use the same tools for both API and web.
My primary tool almost always is Burp Proxy, because that's going to let me see everything going in and out. But I also have used Postman quite a bit. And I've even used a tool in the past called SOAP UI. I don't know if it's still named that, though. But I'll have to go back and look. But I've used that one in the past because they actually had some really cool built-in security tests that were fun to throw in there. Sometimes it was crazy. I could get one of them to work and then the other one wouldn't work for a certain API. And it was just the way that they each sort of configured things differently. But over the years, that's changed. And Burp has expanded so exponentially with add-ons and everything that I typically find most of what I need there. And I love just to stay in repeater. I'm almost always in repeater mode, where I'm just like, ticking away and just looking at how things are coming back.
Yeah. The Burp Suite's something I use a lot. I use it for the CO2 extension a lot.
Oh, yeah. I like that. That's a good extension.
Yeah. So I use WFuzz a lot for fuzzing. I know you can use Burp Intruder, but I have issues with that sometimes running in a VM. It's used a lot. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It will really suck up the memory. I agree there. I've had it crash Burp a couple times. But that's probably because I've got a billion repeater tabs open. And I also have like a search going because I'm looking for sensitive strings. And I've run the intruder with like over 2,000 or 3,000 iterations of something. So, not that I'm trying to like DOS something. It's just, I don't know, it should be able to handle, that amount of records.
Yeah, but plus we have to fit our testing in within that time window,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, multitasking.
And you also want to have a large range of things because, usually 100 for an item, like when we're iterating through values, doesn't always cut it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do like that. And I'm a huge fan of WFuzz as well, GoBuster, and even FFuff. I love FFuff.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Do you ever do vulnerability scanning against API endpoints using something other than Burp Suite, maybe?
Oh, not as much. I like Burp's tools typically for that. I know that there are some API tools. Every now and then I will run out and I'll use some like Python script or something that I've vetted and looked through that's really good at maybe uncovering some API issues. But for the most part, I feel like API stuff can be fairly straightforward once you understand it. You know, you're say, for instance, you're looking for Ebola. So we talked about looking at the sequential identifiers and going through and just trying to iterate through that and changing things up. Like, okay, so apparently if I do a get with this and it's trying to get user ID 500, it gives me that because I'm 500. But if I put 501, it says no. But what if I change that get to a head or a patch or something other, like a different HTTP verb? You know, that type of thing for me is where I like to try to like manipulate and play with and see if I can get something to come back. How about you? Is there any specific like vulnerability tools that you use outside of Burp for APIs?
No. A lot of the API stuff I do kind of treat as web. Like for instance, the server. You know, like obviously you run like your nuclei, NEAK2, whatever. Like you said, the scripts, you just throw it at it. You test the service. But yeah, when it comes to automation and doing the security checks, I'm just always using WFuzz. I'm kind of a dork. I'm lame.
No, that's okay. If it's your tool and it works, I say go for it. I think we all are, automation it's nice, but I think sometimes automation ends up missing things. And a lot of times people aren't watching the logs. And I really recommend that too with Burp. I can't tell you how many people I've seen run active scan on stuff and think, okay, I'll wait for it to show up. I'll go grab some tea. And then they're not watching the logs and seeing they're like actually getting disconnected through them. And it's not really even testing anything.
Yeah, this has been a great talk. To recap, we walked through what an API penetration test even was, some of the things you should be doing in your planning of API penetration testing from the client side, certain things you should be requesting from your clients, like documentation information, stuff like that. Then we crawled through all of the OWASP top 10 for API penetration testing kind of categories and broke down each one. We talked about some tools. I think that's it. I think that was the show. That's it.